The snow had not yet left the ground in Sweetwater Crossing when Blythe Callum woke at 4 a.m. and pulled on her boots in the dark. She did not light a lamp right away. She had learned years ago that she could navigate the cabin by memory alone, moving her large body through the narrow spaces between furniture with a quietness that surprised people who looked at her and assumed she would be loud. People who looked at her assumed a great many things. She had stopped keeping track of all of them somewhere around her 20th year, when the list had grown too long to be useful. She was 26 now. Her body was what it had always been, wide across the shoulders, heavy through the middle, her hips broad enough that she turned slightly sideways to pass through the storeroom door without catching the frame. Her arms were thick and capable. Her hands were large, the palms calloused in specific places that told the story of the work she did better than any introduction ever could. The birthmark ran from her left jaw down the side of her neck, dark reddish-brown, the color of old cedar bark, impossible to hide and long past the point where she tried. Her left hip gave her trouble in the cold, a deep aching thing that lived in the joint like an old tenant who had stopped paying rent but refused to leave. She walked with a slight favor to the right on mornings like this one, when the temperature had dropped overnight and the ground outside was iron-hard and unforgiving. She lit the lantern only when she reached the yard. The wagon wheel had come in the night before with Clem Hadley, who had stopped at the trading post just before dark with a broken spoke and a delivery contract due in Rawlins by Friday. Clem was a decent man and one of the few reliable sources of income the Callum trading post still had. She was not going to let him lose the Rawlins contract over a broken spoke. She crouched beside the wheel in the cold, her breath coming out in small white clouds, and she worked. The repair was not complicated if you knew what you were doing. She knew what she was doing. She had been learning the maintenance work of this property since she was old enough to carry tools, filling the gaps that her father had left when he died, then the gaps that her mother could not fill, then eventually the gaps that simply existed because a trading post on the edge of Wyoming territory required more from its people than most people had to give. She worked for 2 hours in the dark before the sky began to change color. Inside the cabin, her mother was already moving. She could hear Willa through the kitchen wall, the particular sound of the iron being set to heat, the deliberate, careful sequence of a woman preparing for something important. Blythe continued working on the wheel and listened to those sounds and understood them without needing to see them. Her mother had been making those sounds since yesterday evening, since the letter had come from Harold in Casper, confirming that a man named Holt Greer would be arriving Thursday morning and was interested in meeting the Callum family. The Callum family. That was the language of the letter. The Callum family. Blythe knew what that meant. She had always known what it meant when people used language that inclusive. It meant Calla. It meant her younger sister, who was 22 years old and had the kind of face that stopped men on busy streets, the kind of easy grace that made rooms rearrange themselves around her without anyone noticing it was happening. Calla was the plan. Calla had always been the plan. Blythe had understood this for so long that it had stopped feeling like a wound and had become, instead, something more like weather, a condition of the landscape. You did not argue with the weather. You dressed for it and you kept moving. The kitchen door opened. Her mother came out onto the back step in her housecoat, arms crossed against the cold, and looked at Blythe crouching in the yard with grease on her hands and lantern light throwing shadows across her large frame. "Stay in the back today," Willa said. The words came out flat, without preamble, without apology. "Do not come to the front of the house. Do not come out to the yard when he is here. Do not let him see you before I have had a chance to introduce things properly." Blythe did not look up from the wheel. She said nothing, which was its own kind of answer, and her mother understood that answer and went back inside, and the door closed, and Blythe was alone again in the dark yard with the lantern and the broken wheel and the specific cold of a Wyoming March that did not care what kind of morning you were having. She finished the repair before the sun was fully up. She set the wheel against the fence post where Clem could find it. She went inside and washed her hands at the basin and started the bread without being asked. Because the bread needed starting and she was there and she had hands, and that had always been sufficient reason. The dough was thick and she worked it with her full weight, her broad shoulders rolling forward and back in the steady rhythm she had learned from her grandmother, who had also been a large woman and had also been treated as furniture by most of the people around her. Her grandmother had told her once that there was dignity in work that did not need an audience. Blythe had been 12 years old and had not understood it then. She understood it now. She understood it in the specific way of a woman who had been keeping the accounts of a failing trading post for 3 years without telling anyone in the family how bad the numbers actually were. The flour bin was getting low. She noted this without writing it down because she did not need to write it down. She carried the inventory of this property in her head the way some people carried music, completely and without effort. Every item in every shelf and storeroom cataloged against the running calculation of what they needed, what they could afford, what could wait, and what absolutely could not. What could not wait was the payment to Conrad Vance. She pushed that thought to the side of her mind and kept working the dough. Holt Greer arrived at 9 in the morning. She heard the horse first. One rider, coming at an easy pace, not hurried. The measured approach of a man who had been in the saddle long enough to stop wasting motion. She heard her mother's voice go up on the porch. That particular note Willa hit when she was performing graciousness for someone she needed something from. She heard Calla's voice underneath it, lower, warm, calibrated to exactly the right temperature. Blythe turned to the kitchen window. She told herself she was checking the light. She told herself she was not looking. She looked. He was already off his horse, already still in the way of men who have spent enough time in difficult country to stop performing stillness and simply be it. He was listening to her mother with his hat in both hands, and his eyes, even from this distance, even through the warped kitchen glass, were moving, not fixed on Calla the way every other man's eyes fixed on Calla, moving, taking in the yard, the fence line, the storeroom door, the repaired wagon wheel sitting against the post where Clem would find it. He looked at the wheel for a moment longer than he looked at anything else. Then he looked at the kitchen window. Blythe stepped back from the glass. Her heart was doing something she had not given it permission to do, and she told it firmly to stop. She went back to the bread. She worked the dough with the focused, deliberate energy she applied to everything that needed doing, because the work was always there, and the work never disappointed her by being something other than exactly what it was. She did not hear him cross the yard. She did not hear him come up the side of the house. What she heard was the kitchen door, the hinges she had been meaning to oil for 2 weeks, announcing him with a long, low groan that she felt somewhere behind her back teeth. She turned. He was in the doorway, hat in both hands, eyes on her face, not scanning, not flinching, not doing the elaborate, careful performance of not staring that most people performed when they encountered her birthmark for the first time. Just looking at her the way you look at something you are genuinely trying to understand. "You are the one who fixed Hadley's wheel," he said. Blythe's hands went still in the dough. "How do you know that?" she said. "Rode in from the north. Passed him on the road. He was still talking about it 20 minutes later. He stepped fully inside, and the kitchen felt different with him in it. Not smaller, differently weighted. He said a woman at the Callum place fixed his wheel in the dark at 4 in the morning and saved his contract. He said it simply, without decoration. Grateful men talk, he said. Cannot hold it against them. His eyes moved briefly to the dough, to her flour-covered hands, to the organized row of tin canisters on the shelf above the work table, then back to her face. Your name is Blythe, he said. It was not a question. It is, she said. Holt Greer. I know who you are. Then you know why I came. She held his gaze. She had a rule about that, about not looking away first. A rule she had made for herself at 18 and had kept every day since. You came for Calla, she said. I came to find a wife. He turned his hat once in his hands, a slow rotation that was habit rather than nerves. I did not ride 3 days with the name already decided. Something moved in her chest that she did not examine. My mother would tell you Calla is the better choice, she said. Your mother has been telling me quite a lot since I stepped out of the saddle. The tone was not unkind, but it was direct. The directness of a man who filtered what he said through accuracy rather than diplomacy. She is a thorough woman. She wants what is best. She wants what she thinks is best. Blythe said, those are not always the same thing. He looked at the fence line through the kitchen window, the posts on the north side. You set those last fall. They needed doing. Stone-packed base, good depth. Those will hold 10 years. He looked back at her. How long have you been running the maintenance on this property? I do not run anything, she said. Things need doing, and I do them. That is the same thing. Miss Callum. She pulled the dough once, hard. Mr. Greer, what are you doing in my kitchen? Introducing myself, he said. Properly, without an audience managing the introduction. She looked at him for a long moment. The measuring look she had used all her life to find the distance between what people said and what they meant. The gap between those two things was usually wide enough to fall through. She was looking for it now. She could not find it. You should go back to the porch, she said. Calla is waiting. I expect she is. He did not move. Your sister is beautiful. Anyone with eyes can see that. Your mother has built a great deal on it. I understand why. He paused. I am also 34 years old, he said, and I have seen what happens when a man chooses the thing everyone tells him to choose without asking himself whether it is the thing he actually needs. I need a partner, not an ornament. The blood came up in her face, not from pleasure, from the collision of too many things arriving at the same time. Disbelief. The particular ache of wanting something to be true so badly that believing it feels like a trap. The long practiced reflex of a woman who has been set aside so many times that being chosen starts to feel more dangerous than being overlooked. Those are fine words, she said. They are. I mean them regardless. Meaning and living are different things. They are, he agreed. That is why I would like time to show you which one I am doing. The door from the front room opened with enough force to announce itself. Willa came through it with the energy of a woman who has just realized a carefully constructed plan is being dismantled by someone who did not receive the script. Her eyes went from Holt to Blythe, to the flower on Blythe's hands, to the birthmark, to the loose hair, and whatever she had been about to say rearranged itself into something more controlled. Mr. Greer, Willa said. I am not sure how you ended up in the kitchen. Calla is I would like to court Blythe, Holt said. The silence was total. Even the sounds from outside seemed to stop. Willa's face did not fall apart. She was too practiced for that. But something behind it shifted. Some deep certainty that had been standing so long she had stopped checking whether it was still sound. Her mouth opened, closed. She looked at her older daughter, the one she had spent 26 years working around and past and in spite of, and the look on her face was not cruelty. It was something almost worse than cruelty. It was genuine bewilderment. She simply could not make the pieces fit. You mean, Willa started. Blythe, Holt said. Yes, but Calla is. Willa gestured toward the front room, toward everything Calla represented. toward the whole architecture of what she had been building for years. "I can see that," Holt said. His voice was even, patient, absolute. "I would still like to court Blythe, with your permission." The front room door opened a second time and Calla walked through it. She had been listening. She was too smart not to have been listening. She came in with her chin up and her eyes bright and her smile in place. That polished, deliberate smile that Blythe had watched work on every man Calla had ever aimed it at. She looked at Holt Greer with the full impact of herself, and something happened that Blythe had never seen happen in 26 years of watching men look at her sister. Nothing happened. He looked at Calla the way he had looked at the fence posts, with acknowledgement, with accuracy, without hunger. And then he looked back at Blythe. Calla's smile stayed exactly where it was, but her eyes shifted to her sister with an expression that moved through several things too quickly to name before arriving somewhere that Blythe recognized because she had worn the same expression herself for most of her life. The expression of someone who has just discovered that the world does not organize itself the way they were told it would. "There is no confusion," Holt said when Calla started to speak. He was not unkind. He was simply a man who had made a decision based on the information available to him and was stating it with the same plainness he brought to everything else. "I hope that is not a difficulty." Calla looked at her sister then. Just looked at her. The name in her eyes without the sound of it, as if she were asking the name to explain itself. Blythe looked back at her sister and felt the full weight of what was happening. Not triumph, not even relief, something heavier, something that required someone else to lose something in order for her to have it, and she had never wanted to be the kind of woman who required that. "Why don't you give us a minute?" she said quietly. Calla walked out of the kitchen. Her steps were measured and even. The door closed behind her with a careful, deliberate click that was somehow worse than a slam. Willa stood for one more moment, looked at Holt, looked at Blythe, pressed her lips together in the expression she used when she was accepting something she did not have the language to argue with. Then she walked out without a word, which was the loudest thing she could have done. The kitchen was just the two of them. Blythe breathed out slowly. She looked at the dough on the table. She looked at Holt Greer, who was watching her with the same steady, unhurried attention as before, as if the last 10 minutes had confirmed something rather than complicated it. That was hard for her. Blythe said, "I know. Men do not choose me over Calla." She stopped, started again. "That does not happen. It happened today." She met his eyes. "Why?" she said. Not soft, not grateful, honest. The question she needed answered before she allowed herself to feel anything at all. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of a man assembling a performance, the quiet of a man looking for the accurate thing to say. "I watched you through the yard window for a few minutes before I came to the door," he said. "You were working. You never stopped working. You were not performing anything for anyone. You were doing what needed doing the way it needed to be done." He set his hat on the table. "I have 3 miles of fence that needs reposting. I have a cabin that needs a person who can look at a problem and fix it, rather than look at a problem and wait for someone else. I have a life that is not romantic and not easy, and will not become easier." He looked at her without apology. "I cannot promise you love. I want to be straight about that. I can promise respect, partnership, a man who sees the work you do and knows what it costs." It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. She should have been hurt by the part about love. She told herself later she should have been hurt by it. But in that moment, standing in her mother's kitchen with flour drying on her wide hands and her sister's careful footsteps fading down the hall, what she felt was not hurt. What she felt was the particular relief of being told the truth by someone who thought she was worth telling it to. "Take a walk with me," she said. "To the east fence. There is a cedar stand I sourced the timber from. You can see how I set the posts." He picked up his hat and put it on. "I would appreciate that." She untied her apron, hung it on the nail by the door, pushed a loose pin back into her hair with 2 fingers, and walked out of the kitchen and into the morning beside a man who had looked at everything this household had to offer and asked for the thing no one had ever thought to offer before. They walked with Agnes Pruitt behind them, which was proper, and which Agnes performed with the dignified efficiency of a woman who had done this kind of accompanying before and saw no reason to make a production of it. They had not reached the main road before the trouble started. There were 3 men standing outside Decker's general store, the way men in small towns stand when they have nothing better to do than observe the movement of other people. Blythe had passed these men many times in her life. She knew their names. She knew their wives. She had sold them flour and lamp oil and harness leather for 3 years. They knew her. One of them, a man named Purdy who ran the grain exchange on the east end of town, looked at the 2 of them and said it loudly enough that no one on that block could pretend not to hear. Greer chose the big one. He said it the way you say something you have been saving. Lord help the man. She heard the laughter start. Blythe kept walking. She did not break her stride. Her large body moved forward with the same steady economy she brought to every physical task, and she kept her eyes on the road ahead, and she kept her breathing even, and she let the sound of the laughter hit her back and fall away like something thrown against a wall that was built too thick to care. But her shoulders were tight. Anyone paying real attention could see that. Her shoulders were tight, and her jaw was set, and her left hand had curled slightly at her side, the way a hand curls when the person it belongs to is working very hard at not reacting to something that genuinely costs them. Agnes Pruitt stopped walking. Blythe and Holt both slowed and turned to look. Agnes had turned around to face the 3 men in front of Decker's store. She did not raise her voice. Agnes Pruitt never raised her voice. She simply spoke at the volume of a woman who had been making herself heard in open country for 58 years and had no need of volume to accomplish it. "You want to talk about what is standing in front of you," Agnes said. "All right. What is standing in front of you is the woman who negotiated your grain delivery contract last October when Hendricks pulled out and left you short. What is standing in front of you is the woman who extended credit to the Purdy household in February when the shipment from Cheyenne came in damaged and your wife needed flour to feed your children. What is standing in front of you is the only person in this town who has read every supply contract that moves through Sweetwater Crossing in the last 3 years and has not once made an error." She let that sit for a moment. "You boys enjoy your morning," Agnes said, and turned back around and resumed walking at exactly the pace she had been going before. The 3 men said nothing. Holt said nothing either. He did not look at Blythe with the performed sympathy that people sometimes offered, the sideways glance that was supposed to acknowledge what had just happened while also signaling discomfort with it. He simply walked beside her and adjusted his pace by exactly enough to match hers, and that adjustment, made without comment or ceremony, was the most respectful thing anyone had done for her in longer than she could measure. At the fence line, he crouched and pressed his fingers into the base of the nearest post, testing the stone packing with his thumb, checking the depth by feel. "Good," he said. Single word. No elaboration needed. She watched him work his way down the line, post by post, taking the measure of something she had built alone and in her own time over 3 seasons. The east fence had taken her the better part of 2 falls to complete properly. She had done it in the early mornings before the rest of the house woke and in the evenings after the day's accounts were finished, moving her heavy body along the fence line with tools she had learned to use from her father's old manual and her own accumulated trial and error. "You know this land," he said, standing. "I have had to. That is not a criticism. I know it is not." She looked at him steadily. Most men find it unusual. A woman who talks about soil drainage and timber grade. Most men, he said, are looking for something different than what I am looking for. She did not answer that. She filed it somewhere careful. They walked back toward the house in the thin March light, and she was aware for the first time in a long while of not walking alone. Not because he was doing anything particular, simply because his presence beside her had a quality of permanence to it that she had not encountered before in relation to herself. A quality that suggested he had decided where he was going to stand and had no plans to revise that decision based on what anyone else thought about it. "Mr. Greer," she said. "Yes, you should know something." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I am not my sister. I cannot be my sister. I will not perform warmth I do not feel, or gratitude I have not earned, or softness that is not real. I am exactly what you have seen today. No better presentation is coming." He looked at her for a long moment. "Good," he said. That was all. They returned to the house. Willa met them on the porch with the courtesy of a woman who had spent an hour negotiating with herself and arrived at a ceasefire that was not yet a peace. She accepted Holt's request to return on Tuesday and Thursday with something that looked like composure but was made of different materials than composure usually is. He put on his hat, mounted his horse, and rode north without looking back. Blythe stood on the porch and watched him go. Willa stood beside her in silence for a moment that stretched past comfortable and into something else. "He could have had Calla," Willa said finally. "Without a moment's difficulty. Every man who has ever come to this house. I know. Mama, what does he want from you?" The sentence had a weight to it that Willa seemed to regret the moment it left her mouth, a weight that came not from cruelty, but from genuine bewilderment, from 26 years of operating on a set of assumptions that had just been revised without her permission. Blythe looked at her mother. "He told me what he wants," she said. "A partner, someone who can work." She looked back at the road where the dust from his horse had already settled. "Maybe that is not romantic enough for you to understand, but it is more than anyone has ever offered me." She paused. "I am going to finish the bread." She walked back into the kitchen. Her hands were steadier than she expected them to be. She worked the dough and tried to walk herself back into the careful, managed distance she had kept for years, the reasonable distance from hope that had kept her functional through 26 years of being treated as something to work around. She told herself it was too early. She told herself she did not know him. She told herself that one morning and one honest conversation and one walk to the east fence were not a foundation. All of that was true. She believed all of it. And still, when the last sound of his horse faded out on the northern road, something in her chest that had been quiet for a very long time said without her permission the word Tuesday. Down the hall behind a closed door, Calla was silent. In that silence, in the particular weight of it, Blythe heard for the first time the sound of something she had not expected to hear in this house. Not the silence of indifference, the silence of someone sitting very still with a feeling they had not known they were capable of having. Blythe shaped the loaves, slid them into the oven, and stood at the work table with her large flour-covered hands resting on the edge of the wood. She let herself think about Tuesday for exactly 30 seconds. Then she went back to work. It was 2 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, that the letter arrived. She found it in the afternoon post, addressed to Mrs. Willa Callum, Sweetwater Crossing, Wyoming Territory. In the precise formal handwriting of a man who wrote a great deal of correspondence and had long since made his penmanship match his professional reputation. The return address was the offices of Conrad Vance, Casper. She should have set it aside. She should have left it on the kitchen table for her mother to open. Instead, she looked at the envelope for a long time. She had been watching the mail from Casper for 3 years. She knew this handwriting. She had seen it on the quarterly statements, on the payment confirmations, on the formal notices that arrived with the regularity of seasons and the warmth of winter. She set the envelope on the kitchen table and went to get her mother. Willa opened it at the table with Blythe sitting across from her and Calla standing in the doorway with her hands folded and her face carefully neutral. Willa read it once. She set it down. She looked at it as though it had said something in a language she had almost but not quite understood. Blythe reached across and turned the letter to face her. She read it twice. Then she read the 3rd page again slowly, the page with the clause that had always been there in the original agreement, on page 3. In the smaller print that her mother had apparently not read carefully enough or had chosen to treat as a formality rather than a mechanism. The acceleration clause. 90 days from the date of this letter. Full remaining balance due, not monthly payments. The full remaining balance of $460, which would require the trading post, the property, and everything on it to cover, and would still leave them short. 90 days. Blythe set the letter down. She looked at her hands on the table. Her large, capable, flour-dusted hands, the hands that had been keeping this property alive for 3 years, while the numbers in the ledger moved in one direction and the months moved in another. She had known this was coming. She had not known it had a date yet. Now it did. Calla looked at her from the doorway. "What does it say?" Calla asked. Blythe looked up at her mother, then at her sister, then at the letter on the table between them. She thought about Holt Greer riding north in the thin afternoon light. She thought about Tuesday. "It says," Blythe said quietly, "that we have 90 days to save this family." The silence that followed those words was different from the silences that usually filled the Callum household. This one had weight. It pressed against the walls and the ceiling and the 3 women sitting inside it. And nobody moved to break it because breaking it would mean beginning to deal with what it contained. Willa looked at the window. Calla had not moved from the doorway. Blythe folded the letter along its original creases and placed it back in the envelope and set the envelope in the center of the table where all 3 of them could see it without having to look at each other. "Do not tell anyone about this," Blythe said. "Not the neighbors, not Clem Hadley. Not the women at the church auxiliary. When news like this gets into the air of a small town, it changes how people do business with you. And we cannot afford for people to change how they do business with us right now." Willa nodded without looking away from the window. Calla said nothing, which Blythe understood as agreement. She went to the back room where the ledger lived on the shelf above the small writing desk she had claimed as her own space years ago without anyone formally assigning it to her. She sat down with a lamp and a piece of paper and did what she always did when the world presented a problem without a comfortable answer. She worked the numbers until they told her something true. They told her something true at 10 that night. She sat with it for a while in the quiet of the house, and then she blew out the lamp and went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about Holt Greer. Not about what he could do for her. She was careful about that. She had made herself a promise about that. But she thought about what he had said. "I cannot promise love, only respect and partnership." She thought about what a partnership actually looked like when it was built on accurate information, rather than on hope dressed up as something sturdier than it was. She thought about Tuesday. Tuesday arrived with a sky the color of old pewter and a wind off the mountains that still carried real winter in it, despite what the calendar said. Holt came at 9 in the morning, as he had said he would. Agnes Pruitt rode beside him on her steady roan mare, straight-backed and direct-eyed, the way Agnes moved through everything. Blythe was waiting on the porch with her coat on and the letter from Conrad Vance in her inside pocket. He looked at her face when he dismounted. Something in his own expression shifted, not dramatically, but in the way of a man who is reading a situation accurately and has decided to wait for the information before drawing conclusions. "Something happened," he said. "Yes. Come inside." They sat at the kitchen table. Agnes settled into the chair nearest the window with the manner of a woman who had witnessed a great many important conversations and understood that her role in this one was to be present and say nothing until saying something became useful. Blythe took the letter from her pocket and set it on the table in front of Holt. She did not explain it. He was not a man who needed information managed for him. He read it once. He read it again. He set it down and looked at it for a moment with the expression he had given the fence posts, not alarmed, not dismissive, taking the measure of a real problem with real intention to address it. $460, he said. Full balance. Remaining balance. Yes, 90 days from when the letter was dated. We have closer to 83 now. Agnes, who had read the letter over his shoulder without asking permission, sat forward slightly. "What does the post bring in monthly?" $40 in a good month. This will not be a good month. The Henderson family stopped buying on account 2 weeks ago. I believe they heard something about the debt situation, which means the information is already moving whether I try to stop it or not. Best case, Blythe continued, the post brings in $35 a month over the next 3 months. That is roughly $100 before the deadline. We would still be $360 short. Holt looked at the letter, then at her. "I have resources," he said. "No." She said it without heat, without movement, without any of the emotion running underneath the surface of her composure. "I am not going to let you pay my family's debt. That is not a partnership. That is a rescue. And I did not ask to be rescued. And if that is what you came here prepared to offer, then we have been misunderstanding each other from the beginning." Holt held her gaze. "I was not offering you money. I was stating a fact about my situation the same way you stated a fact about the post's monthly income. It is information, not a solution." Agnes made a small sound that was not quite agreement, but was pointed in that direction. Blythe breathed out. "I am sorry," she said. "I moved too fast." "Tell me what you are thinking," he said. He told her. He had been thinking about it since he rode away on Thursday, not about the debt specifically. He had not known about the debt, but about the trading post itself, what it was and what it could be. He had been watching the commerce patterns in this part of the territory for several years, and the Callum post was positioned better than it operated. The road through this property was the most direct route between 2 growing supply points. The problem was not location. The problem was capitalization and management depth. Blythe listened to him describe this and felt a strange doubling, because she had thought all of this herself. She had known it in the ledger hours, in the 4 a.m. working hours, had known it with the frustration of a person who can see the solution clearly and cannot reach it because the solution requires a resource they do not have. "You have thought about the post," she said. "I have thought about this whole property," he said, "for 3 weeks, since the introduction letter arrived from Harold." He met her eyes. "I want to be straight with you about something. I was not looking for a wife when I came here. I was looking at a business situation. And then I got here, and I looked through the kitchen window, and I changed my mind about what I was doing here. The kitchen was very quiet." Agnes Pruitt looked at the ceiling. "You came here for the post," Blythe said. Her voice was level. She was making herself keep it level. "Originally, yes." He looked at his hands on the table. "I am not going to pretend those 2 things are not tangled together. They are, but I want to be clear about which one I care about more." He looked at her directly. "The post is a sound investment. There are 4 men I know who would take it. But I am sitting in this kitchen." She looked at him for a long time. She was doing the calculation she had always done, the one that measured the distance between what people said and what they meant. She was looking for the place where his words and his intentions separated from each other. She could not find it. Again, the same as Thursday, the same as the fence line, no separation anywhere she looked. "What would you propose?" she said. He proposed it with the same practical clarity he brought to everything. A documented legal partnership in the post. Not a favor, not a gift. He would provide the capital to service the Vance debt and properly restock the inventory. She would run the operation because she already was running it and was better at it than anyone he had seen manage a post this size. The arrangement would exist separately from whatever happened between them personally. If she decided she did not want to continue the courtship, the business arrangement would stand on its own terms. "Write what you think is fair," he said, "and I will read it." She looked at him. "You will take my terms. I will read your terms," he said, "and tell you if I think they are fair. That is how a negotiation between partners works." Agnes stood up from her chair and walked out of the kitchen with the determined, deliberate energy of a woman leaving a room on purpose and wanting both parties to know it. Blythe and Holt sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the letter from Conrad Vance between them, and the lamp burning low and the March wind pressing against the windows. "Holt," she said. It was the first time she had used his name without the formality attached. She felt him register it, barely, just a slight stillness that had not been there a moment before. "If I agree to the business arrangement, that is separate from the other thing. You understand that completely. I am not going to agree to court you because you are solving my family's problem. I will not do that." "I know," he said, "because that would not be a choice. It would be a transaction." She looked at him. "The business arrangement can be settled this week if you want it settled," he said, "because 83 days is not much runway, but the other thing can take as long as it needs to take. Certainty does not require speed. It only requires not giving up." She looked at the table, at the letter, at her hands resting on either side of it, large and calloused and entirely themselves. "There is something I need to tell you," she said. He waited. "Calla is not handling this well, not cruelly. She is not making trouble for anyone, but she is sitting with something she does not have language for yet, and that is more dangerous in the long run than anger would be. Angry people say things you can address. People sitting quietly with something unresolved act on it eventually in ways you cannot always predict." He absorbed this without visible reaction. He took it in as information and filed it where it belonged. "Thank you for telling me," he said. She stood. She went to the back room and came back with the ledger and set it on the table in front of him. "Read this," she said. "All of it. I want you to understand exactly what the situation is before you make any financial commitment. I do not want you to be surprised later." He pulled the ledger toward him and opened it. He read carefully, with full attention. Blythe made coffee. She set a cup beside him and sat with her own and waited. He read for 20 minutes. He asked 2 questions, both precise, both about line items that deserved a question. She answered them precisely. He closed the ledger. "You have been managing this alone for 3 years, he said. "Yes, and carrying the real numbers by yourself that whole time. Telling my mother the real numbers 3 years ago would have caused her to make decisions out of fear. She would have sold things that did not need to be sold, cut supplies we needed to keep. The fear would have cost us more than the debt." She looked at her coffee. "I thought I could correct the trajectory before it reached this point. I was wrong about the timeline. You were not wrong about the management," he said. "You stretched this further than most men I know could have managed." She looked up at him. "That is not flattery," he said before she could speak. "It is an assessment. I have seen what I have seen, and I know the difference." She knew there was a difference. She had known it her whole life, because nobody had spent much time on the second kind in relation to her. The front door opened before either of them could say anything more. Not the kitchen door. The front door. The one that faced the road. Willa's voice from the front room, carefully assembled. "May I help you?" A man's voice. Unfamiliar. Carrying an edge even through walls. Looking for the Callum trading post. Was told this was it. It is. Who is calling? Fletcher Vance. Here on behalf of my father, Conrad Vance of Casper. Blythe was through the kitchen doorway before the name finished landing. Holt was 2 steps behind her. The man standing in the Callum front doorway was perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of appearance that announced itself and asked questions later. He was well dressed for the territory. Not frontier practical, but deliberately presentable. The clothing of a man who wanted to be read as prosperous. He held his hat in one hand and was looking at Willa with the focused attention of someone who had come to deliver a message and wanted to be certain the recipient understood its weight. His eyes moved to Blythe when she came through the doorway. They moved past her in the brief, automatic way that Blythe had been receiving from men her entire life, a half-second dismissal so practiced it happened below the level of conscious decision. And then his eyes found Holt behind her, and stopped. Something recalculated in his expression. The small adjustment of a man who has arrived expecting one set of variables and encountered a different set entirely. "Mrs. Callum," he said, finding Willa. "My father received your family's most recent payment and asked me to come discuss the account in person. He felt a personal conversation might be more productive than correspondence, given the situation." "Given the situation," Blythe said. "A personal conversation regarding a financial matter should involve me, since I manage the accounts. Any terms discussed should happen with full documentation present." She looked at him directly. "Would you like to sit down, Mr. Vance?" He looked at her with an expression that had not expected this. He looked at Holt. He looked back at Blythe. And whatever he had prepared to say rearranged itself into something that needed a moment to reassemble. "Please," she said. "Come in." The conversation that followed was careful and specific, and took the better part of an hour. Fletcher Vance had come prepared. He had figures. He had language. He had the polished confidence of a man whose father's name opened doors in this part of the territory, and who had learned to move through those doors as though he had built them himself. He laid out the situation without unnecessary cruelty, but without unnecessary softness either. The acceleration clause was binding. The timeline was firm. His father was, Fletcher said, genuinely hoping for a resolution that did not require legal enforcement. Blythe listened. She asked questions. She took notes on the paper she had brought from the back room. She confirmed figures. She asked twice about specific clauses and made him show her the relevant sections in the copy of the agreement he had brought with him. Holt sat to her left and said nothing, not because he had nothing to contribute, because he understood that this was not his conversation to lead. His presence was not performative. He was simply there, steady and present, and that steadiness had its own function without requiring announcement. At the end of the hour, Fletcher sat back and looked at Blythe with an expression that had shifted considerably from the one he had arrived with. "You understand the situation clearly," he said. There was something in his voice that was approaching respect from the general direction. "I do," Blythe said. "I will need 5 days to put together a formal response. I would like to propose a structured settlement arrangement that addresses your father's legitimate concerns while preserving the operational capacity of the post." Fletcher looked at her steadily. "My father is open to discussion, but he asked me to make one thing clear before I leave today." He paused. "He is also open to a different kind of arrangement entirely. One that would restructure the debt not as a repayment schedule but as an equity position. 60% to the Vance interests. 40% retained by your family with full operational management. Blythe looked at him. "Read me the dissolution clause on that arrangement," she said. Fletcher blinked. "Page 4, she said. "Third paragraph. Would you like me to read it, or would you prefer to read it yourself so we can discuss it accurately?" He opened his copy of the document. He found the page. He read the paragraph. When he looked up, something in his expression had changed in a way that was harder to categorize than the first recalculation. "That clause," Blythe said, "means that if this family ever chooses to sell or restructure in the future, we require your father's written approval to do so. That is not an equity position. That is a permanent obligation disguised as an investment. The answer is no." Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "I will convey your position to my father," he said. "Please also convey that I will have a counter-proposal in writing within 5 days. One that gives him a genuine return on a genuine investment without attaching a permanent obligation to the family that owns the operation his investment depends on." Fletcher stood. He gathered his papers. He looked at Blythe one final time, a longer look than any of the previous ones, with something in it that had abandoned the automatic dismissal of the first moment and arrived somewhere more complicated. He looked at Holt on his way to the door. Holt looked back at him with the calm of a man who has nothing to prove and knows it. Fletcher left. The door closed. Agnes appeared in the kitchen doorway, which confirmed she had been there for some time. She looked at the closed front door. She looked at Blythe. "He will be back," Agnes said. "I know," Blythe said. "Not just about the debt. I know that too." The 5 days that followed were the most concentrated work of Blythe's life, and she had set a high standard in that category. She drafted the counter-proposal at the writing desk in the back room, using the ledger as her foundation and the supply route information Holt brought her on Thursday as her forward projection. She wrote clearly and specifically and did not soften any of it. Holt reviewed the numbers. Agnes reviewed the language. And then, on the second evening, Calla came and stood in the doorway of the back room with her hands folded and her face doing something complicated. "Can I help?" Calla said. Blythe looked at her sister for a moment. "Come sit down," she said. Calla sat. She looked at the papers on the desk. She looked at the ledger with its 3 years of entries in Blythe's careful handwriting, the running record of a property kept alive by someone who was never supposed to be the one doing the keeping. "You have been doing this the whole time," Calla said. "Yes." Calla was quiet. Then she picked up the draft response and read it from the beginning. She read slowly and carefully, and when she reached the 3rd paragraph, she took the pencil from the desk without asking and made a notation in the margin. "This sentence reads as a demand," she said. "You want it to read as a proposal. There is a difference in how it lands even when the content is identical." Blythe looked at the sentence, looked at the notation. "You are right," she said. "They worked for 2 hours. It was the most useful Calla had ever been in this household, and they both understood that without saying it. Calla had always had the instinct for how words landed in other people's ears. She had simply never been pointed at anything real before. The letter went out on Friday with Clem Hadley's driver, addressed to Conrad Vance personally. 3 days later, Fletcher Vance came back. He arrived on a Monday afternoon while Blythe was outside checking the inventory on a new delivery, making notations on her clipboard with the focused efficiency of a woman who accounted for every item before it crossed the threshold into storage. She heard his horse in the yard and did not look up until she had finished the current line. He dismounted and looked at the storeroom door with its updated inventory list, at the new stacking arrangement she had implemented, at the careful organization of a post that was being run better than most people in this territory knew. "Miss Blythe," he said. She looked at him. "Mr. Vance, I was not expecting you. I was passing through the area. Has your father received my letter? He has. He asked me to say he found it thorough. She went back to her count. He can send his response in writing. He thought a personal conversation might be more productive. She stopped counting. She turned and faced him fully. Mr. Vance, tell me what your father actually wants, so we can stop spending time on the approach. Something moved across his expression. He looked at the storeroom door again, then back at her. He wants the post to succeed, Fletcher said, genuinely. He has seen the projections you put together, and he believes they are achievable. He is willing to discuss your terms, but he has asked me to explore one additional avenue before formal negotiations begin. She waited. He believes you might be more favorably positioned if certain other obligations were not complicating your situation. Fletcher met her eyes. The arrangement with Greer, he said, my father has reason to believe it is not yet formalized. If that situation were to remain unresolved, it might open certain additional options that would benefit your family significantly. He has connections in Casper that could be very useful to your sister. The yard was very quiet. The delivery driver found something requiring close attention at the far end of the wagon. Blythe set her clipboard against the storeroom wall. She looked at Fletcher Vance with the measuring attention she gave every problem she encountered, finding the true shape of it before deciding how to respond. Go back to Casper, she said. Tell your father I will have nothing further to discuss with anyone who sends messages through his son about my personal life. Tell him that if he wants to negotiate the terms I proposed, I am available in writing. And tell him that the next time someone suggests that my value in a business arrangement depends on what I do or do not do with my private life, that conversation is over before it starts. Fletcher held her gaze for a moment. Miss Blythe, he said carefully, you should understand that my father has other options for this kind of investment. There are other posts along this route. There are, she said. None of them have my numbers. None of them have my contracts. And none of them have 3 years of demonstrated performance in difficult conditions. Your father knows that. That is why you are standing in my yard instead of someone else's. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something she did not expect. He almost smiled. I will convey your message, he said. He left. Blythe stood in the yard after the sound of his horse faded and thought about what he had said about Willa, about the approach through her mother, whether Fletcher had already tried that avenue before coming to her directly. She found out that evening. She found the paper in the drawer of the side table in the front room, tucked under the Bible where Willa kept things she was not ready to act on, but could not bring herself to discard. It was a letter in Fletcher's handwriting, addressed to Willa, proposing a private meeting to discuss an arrangement that would clear the Callum debt entirely in exchange for Willa's cooperation in resolving certain complications before formal negotiations resumed. Blythe read it standing in the front room in the low lamplight, with the sound of Willa moving in the kitchen and Calla's footsteps overhead. She folded the letter. She set it on the kitchen table. She waited. Willa came in from the back door, saw the letter on the table, saw Blythe's face, and stopped moving. The kitchen was very quiet. Blythe did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago that a raised voice was a signal that the person raising it had run out of more precise instruments. She had not run out of precise instruments. You have been keeping this in the side table for how long? She said. Willa looked at the letter. 3 days, she said. I did not answer it. But you did not tell me. I did not know what to do with it. Blythe pulled out the chair across from her mother and sat down. She placed her large hands flat on the table on either side of the letter, and she looked at Willa with the expression of a woman who is about to say something that has been waiting to be said for a very long time and has decided it cannot wait any longer. Mama, she said, you have been keeping me in the back of this house since I was old enough to understand why. You kept me out of sight. Because you believed that what I looked like made me less worth presenting to the world. My size, this birthmark, the way I walk. You treated those things as damage, and you treated me as something to manage around. And I let you because I did not have another option, and because a part of me believed you might be right. She paused. I was wrong to let you, and you were wrong to do it. And now a man who wants to take everything we have built is offering you a shortcut that runs straight through me. And I need to know right now whether you are the woman who takes that shortcut or whether you are something else. Willa sat for a long time without speaking. The kitchen clock marked the passing of that time with its small, regular sound. Then Willa said, I did not answer it. I know you did not, Blythe said. But you did not tell me. No. Willa looked at the table. No, I did not. She looked up. I did not tell you because I was ashamed that I was tempted, even for a moment. I was ashamed that any part of me looked at that letter and thought about Calla's future before I thought about yours. After everything you have done for this family without being asked and without being thanked, and without ever once letting me feel how much I owed you, I was still thinking about Calla first. She pressed her lips together. That is not an excuse, Willa said. I do not have one. Blythe looked at her mother for a long moment. The woman who had spent 26 years making the best of what she considered a difficult situation. The woman who had sent her to the back rooms and the backyards and the back of every calculation. Not from cruelty, but from a failure of vision that had lasted so long it had become a kind of architecture. She was not ready to forgive all of it. Some things required more time than a kitchen table conversation could cover. But she was tired of carrying the weight of it alone. Write back to Fletcher Vance, she said. Tell him the answer is no, and there is nothing further to discuss on this topic. And then I need you to stay out of the Vance correspondence from this point forward. The negotiation goes through me. Willa nodded. And one more thing, Blythe said. I need you to trust me to know what I am doing. Not because I am asking for your permission. I am not asking for your permission. I am asking you to stop working against me while I am trying to save this family. Willa looked at her daughter, at the large, capable woman sitting across from her with flowers still on the cuff of her sleeve from the morning's baking, and a ledger full of 3 years of faithful work sitting in the back room. She looked at her the way she had not looked at her in perhaps 26 years, which was to say she actually looked at her. All right, Willa said. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Conrad Vance himself. Not from Fletcher, from Conrad, in his own handwriting, in the precise formal script of a man who chose his words the way a banker chooses collateral. He had received Blythe's counter-proposal. He had reviewed her projections. He was coming to Sweetwater Crossing on Wednesday to discuss the terms in person. Blythe read the letter twice at the kitchen table with her morning coffee cooling beside her. She looked at Holt, who had arrived an hour earlier and was sitting across from her with his own cup, and the quiet attentiveness that she had come to understand was simply how he existed in spaces that mattered to him. He is coming himself, she said. He is, Holt said. That means Fletcher went back to Casper and told his father the situation was more complicated than expected. That is one interpretation. She looked at him. What is the other? That Conrad Vance has been watching this situation more carefully than his son realized, Holt said, and has decided he wants to see for himself what kind of person he is actually dealing with. Blythe held the letter for a moment. She set it on the table between them. I am going to need you to sit beside me in that room and say nothing, she said. Not because I need protection, because I need a witness I trust. He looked at her. I will be there, he said. Every minute. She picked up her coffee. She looked at the letter from Conrad Vance. She thought about the number $460 and the word Wednesday and the days that had been counting down since March. Then she set the cup down and went to the back room to prepare. She spent 2 days on it, not preparing the way a woman prepares for an important visitor, arranging rooms and selecting clothing and rehearsing gracious remarks. She prepared the way she prepared for everything that mattered, which was to know the material so completely that no question he could ask would find her without an answer she had already considered. She went through the ledger entry by entry. She rebuilt the supply route projections, cross-referencing them against the actual delivery records from the past 18 months, to confirm that the numbers she had given Fletcher were not optimistic constructions, but conservative estimates grounded in documented performance. She wrote the key terms of her counterproposal in a separate summary document, clean and without elaboration, because men like Conrad Vance did not need to be walked through reasoning they could follow themselves. They needed to see that the person across the table understood they could follow it. Holt came Tuesday evening and sat with her at the backroom desk while she reviewed the final version. He read what she put in front of him and told her what he actually thought, which was that the interest rate on page 2 was slightly below what Vance would consider credible and should be adjusted upward by a 1/4 point to demonstrate she understood the market rather than hoping he would not notice. She adjusted it. Agnes came Wednesday morning and made coffee. Calla came downstairs early and sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded. She did not need to be told what her role was today. She understood that her role was to be present and steady and to stay out of the way of what her sister was doing. Willa set the front room in order quietly, without commentary. She simply made the room clean and functional, which was the most useful thing she could have done. Conrad Vance arrived at 10 in the morning. He was 60 years old, and he looked like a man who had been 60 for some time, not aged, but settled, the way a well-built structure settles into its foundation and becomes more solid for the process. He was not what Blythe had expected. She had built a picture of him from his letters and his clauses and his payment schedules, and the picture had been accurate as far as it went, but had missed the quality that was most immediately apparent when he stepped into the Callum front room and looked around. He was a man who paid attention, real attention, not the performed kind, the kind that moved through a space and catalogued everything without making a production of the cataloging. His eyes found Blythe first, then Holt, then Agnes, whom he apparently recognized, because something shifted in his expression that looked like a recalibration upward. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said. "Mr. Vance," Agnes said. "It has been some time." Blythe did not ask how they knew each other. She gestured toward the kitchen. "We can sit at the table," she said. "I have the documents ready." "Not the front room," Vance said. He said it without explanation, and she understood from the way he said it that he was the kind of man who preferred to do business in working rooms rather than display rooms. Another piece of information filed and noted. They sat at the kitchen table. Blythe placed the ledger in front of him, open to the first page of the current period. She placed the summary document beside it. She placed her counter-proposal, clean copy, on top of both. "I will let you read before we talk," she said. He read the way she had hoped he would read, going through it the way a careful man goes through something he intends to understand rather than simply react to. He spent 4 minutes on the ledger alone. He asked her one question about an entry in October of the previous year, a dip in revenue that looked anomalous against the surrounding months. Cheyenne shipment came in damaged. She said, "We extended credit to 3 households to cover the gap and collected over the following 6 weeks. The recovery is on the next page." He turned the page. He looked at the recovery figures. He said nothing and went back to reading. Holt sat to Blythe's left with his hands resting on the table and his eyes on the middle distance, a man comfortable with silence and without any intention of breaking it unnecessarily. Agnes sat near the window with her coffee. Willa had positioned herself in the doorway between the kitchen and the back room, present but not at the table, which was exactly right. Conrad Vance finished reading. He set the documents down. He looked at Blythe. "My son told me you read the dissolution clause," he said. "Third paragraph, page 4, she said. "Yes. He told me you read it in the room, without having seen the document in advance. I had reviewed a copy of the original agreement before the meeting." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to understand was his version of being impressed, which was to say it was almost entirely internal and only showed at the edges. "Your projections for the Owl Creek route," he said. "The contact names you included. How confirmed are these? 2 of the 3 have provided written interest. The third is a matter of price negotiation that I have not yet completed." "Why not?" "Because I needed to resolve the primary debt situation before I could credibly commit to the supply volume those contracts would require. Locking in the route before securing the financing would have been putting weight on a structure before the foundation was set." He was quiet for a moment. "What percentage are you proposing?" he said. 49% to the Vance interests. 51% retained by the Callum family with full operational authority. Return on investment projected at 30 months at the revenue figures in column 3, which are deliberately conservative. He looked at the document. "My son recommended 60-40 in our favor." "Your son was trying to acquire an asset," Blythe said. "You are trying to make an investment. Those are different operations with different return profiles. A 60% position in a post that loses its operator is worth less than a 49% position in a post that performs at the numbers I have shown you. You have seen the numbers. You can do that calculation yourself." Agnes took a careful sip of her coffee. Holt looked at the table. "My son also told me," Vance said, "that there was a man in the room during your conversation with him. He described him as a physical presence. He was sitting to my left," Blythe said. "He did not say a word." Vance looked at Holt. "Greer," he said. "Mr. Vance," Holt said. "I know the name," Vance said. "You did federal work in the Wind River Territory 3 years ago." "I did." Vance looked back at Blythe. "And now you are here. Now I am here," Holt said. "In whatever capacity Miss Blythe finds useful." Vance looked between them for a moment with the attention of a man assembling a picture that has more pieces in it than he initially counted. Then he looked back at the documents. "The dissolution clause," he said. "You want it removed entirely. I want it replaced with a right of first refusal at independently assessed market value. If this family chooses to sell its position, you have the first opportunity to purchase it at a fair price. That protects your investment without creating a permanent obligation that follows the family regardless of circumstances. That is standard in arrangements of this kind," Vance said. "It is not standard in the arrangement your son presented," Blythe said. "The clause in that document required your written approval for any restructuring, not just sale. That is not investor protection. That is control." He looked at her for a long time. "You are not what my son described," he said. "What did he describe?" "He said you were difficult." She looked at him steadily. "I am precise. There is a difference." Something shifted in Conrad Vance's expression that she thought might, if she were being generous, be classified as the beginning of a smile. "Right of first refusal at independent assessment," he said. "I can accept that." They worked through the remaining terms over the next hour and 40 minutes. Conrad Vance had not built his position in Casper by accepting the first version of anything he was offered. And Blythe had not kept a failing trading post operational for 3 years by giving ground she could not afford to give. They disagreed twice, once about the interest rate and once about the timeline for the first review period. Both times they worked through it with the efficiency of 2 people who respected the process enough to do it correctly. At the end of the session they had a framework, not a signed agreement yet, but the terms were settled and both parties understood them, and neither party had cause to feel that the other had misrepresented anything. Conrad Vance closed his copy of the documents and looked at Blythe. "My son made a serious error," he said. "Not in the negotiation. Before it, he should have come to you directly from the beginning rather than approaching through intermediaries." He meant Willa. He knew about the letter to Willa. It did not affect the outcome. Blythe said, "No." Vance said, "It did not." He looked at her with the full direct attention of a man who rarely offered this and knew its value. "Because you did not let it." He stood. He shook Holt's hand. He nodded to Agnes with the respect of a man acknowledging someone whose reputation he knew. He looked at Blythe one final time. "I will have the formal documents to you by Friday," he said. "I look forward to the first quarter review." He left. The kitchen was quiet for a long moment after the sound of his horse faded. Agnes set down her coffee cup. "That," she said to no one in particular, "went better than it had any right to go." "It went the way the numbers said it would go," Blythe said. She looked at her hands on the table. "If the work is right, the numbers hold." Holt looked at her across the table. He looked at her with something fully visible now that she had first seen only in glimpses. The quality underneath all the steadiness and the practicality that was what those things were built on top of. He was not managing it. He was not performing it. It was simply there. The way true things are simply there when you stop looking for them and let them be what they are. "Yes," he said, "they do." That evening, after Vance's dust had long settled on the road to Casper, and Agnes had ridden home, and Willa had gone to bed, Holt found Blythe on the east porch, watching the last of the daylight leave the sky above the mountains. He stood beside her without touching, simply occupying the same space in the way that had become, over these past weeks, one of the most reliable things in her life. "Reverend Drum is in town," he said after a while. She looked at him. "Silas Drum. He travels this circuit twice a year. He came in this afternoon and is staying one night at the Decker place, moving west at first light." She looked back at the mountains. "I know who Reverend Drum is," she said. "I know you do." The sky was going from amber to something darker. The Wyoming twilight that did not soften the landscape, but simply withdrew the light from it, leaving the shapes more honest than they were in full day. "I do not want to wait," he said. That was all. She stood with that for a moment. She thought about 90 days that had become 83, and then become something settled. She thought about the ledger in the back room, and the documents coming from Casper on Friday. She thought about Calla at the desk with a pencil in her hand, finally aimed at something real. She thought about her mother's face across the kitchen table when the things that needed to be said had finally been said. She thought about the east fence and the cedar posts, and a man who had pressed his thumb into stone-packed earth and said good with the same plainness he brought to everything true. She looked down at her hands, the large, capable hands, marked by every season of work this property had demanded. She had never thought of them as anything other than functional. She thought of them that way now and felt, for the first time in her life, that functional was not a lesser category, but simply an honest one, and that she had been built for exactly the life she was standing at the edge of. "Let me get my coat," she said. They were married that evening under the cottonwood at the eastern boundary of the Callum property, at the point where the fence line she had built over 3 seasons met the road that ran north toward the mountains. Reverend Silas Drum officiated with the economy of a man who had performed this ceremony in every kind of weather the territory offered and understood that the words themselves carried sufficient weight without ornamentation. Agnes Pruitt stood to Blythe's right. She had appeared at the property within 20 minutes of Holt's quiet words sent through Clem Hadley's boy, which told Blythe something about how Agnes had been spending the past several weeks in terms of readiness. Willa stood to the left, slightly back from the group, with her hands folded at her waist and her face doing the work of composure in the way of a woman who has decided to hold herself together as an act of respect for someone else's moment. Her eyes were wet. She did not let anything fall. Calla stood beside Willa. She had come downstairs in her good dress with her hair pinned and her face arranged in an expression that was not quite happiness and not quite its opposite. Something in between that had not yet found its name. Blythe looked at her sister across the small gathering and understood that Calla was working her way through something that could not be rushed, and that the working through of it was hers alone to do. Willa had found the grandmother's dress in the cedar chest and spent the 20 minutes before the ceremony letting it out at the seams and taking it in at others, working with needle and thread by lamplight, with the precise economy of a woman making the best possible use of exactly the time she had. The dress fit imperfectly and exactly right. Blythe stood in it under the cottonwood in the last of the April evening light and did not think about how she looked. She thought about the fence posts. She thought about stone-packed bases. She thought about things that were built to hold. Holt looked at her when she came out to the yard. His face was open in the way she had first been allowed to see only in glimpses before tonight, stripped of every layer of the practical and the certain all the way down to what those things were built to protect. He looked at her the way you look at something you have been working toward for a long time and have found to be exactly what you believed it would be. Reverend Drum spoke the old words. They answered when they were supposed to answer. The April air held still around them, which in Wyoming in the evening was its own kind of grace. When it was done, Agnes applauded with the brisk satisfaction of a woman whose expectations have been confirmed. Willa pressed her lips together and looked at her daughter with something that had been years arriving and had finally gotten there. And then Calla stepped forward. She did not do it for anyone to see. She walked to where Blythe was standing and she took her sister's hands, the large, calloused hands, and she held them the way you hold something you should have been holding for a long time and are only now understanding the weight of. She looked at Blythe, not with the composed, careful face she had been wearing for weeks, without it. What was underneath was younger and more uncertain and more honest than anything Blythe had seen from her sister in years. "I thought all my life that I was the one in this family who had value," Calla said. Her voice was low, intended only for the two of them. "I was wrong. I was taught wrong, and I believed it. And I am sorry for every day that I stood in front of you and let you disappear behind me without once turning around to see what it cost you." Blythe looked at her sister. "You were taught what you were taught," she said. "We both were." "That is not enough," Calla said. "No," Blythe agreed. "But it is where we start from." Calla held her hands for another moment. Then she released them and stepped back, and the composure returned. Different now, not brittle and performed, but chosen, built on something that had more foundation under it than what had been there before. That evening, after Reverend Drum had gone on his way, and Agnes had ridden home and Willa had gone inside, Blythe and Holt sat on the east porch of the Callum trading post in the cooling night air and looked at the yard and the fence line and the road going north. The documents from Conrad Vance would arrive Friday. The Owl Creek contract still needed finalizing. The north fence section needed checking before the summer ground softened. There was more work ahead than she could list, more problems to solve and decisions to make, and mornings that would require getting up before the sun because the work was there and it needed doing. She was not afraid of any of it. He reached over and took her hand, not with ceremony, simply because it was there and he intended to hold it. They sat in the quiet Wyoming evening and let the stars come out above the mountains, one by one, the way true things come, without announcement, without asking whether you are ready, simply arriving because it is time. The weeks that followed moved with the rhythm of work and weather. The formal documents from Casper arrived Friday as promised, clean and unambiguous. bearing Conrad Vance's signature and the terms exactly as they had been settled across the kitchen table. Blythe read every line before she signed. Then she signed. The Owl Creek negotiation concluded in her favor 3 weeks later. The third contact, a freighter named Aldous Pemberton, who ran goods through the southern passes, had held out for a rate that Blythe would not match until she had the Vance capital secured. With the capital secured, she offered him exactly what the route was worth and not $1 more. He took it. The supply line opened. The Post's monthly revenue in the first full quarter under the new arrangement came in at $58, well above the projections she had shown Conrad Vance and nearly 50% above what the Post had managed in its best previous month. Holt spent the first week splitting his time between the Callum property and his cabin to the north, where the fence work was proceeding on the schedule they had laid out together. He came Tuesday and Thursday and increasingly on other days as well, for reasons that began as practical and became something else. And neither of them made a formal announcement about the transition because it did not require one. It simply happened the way things happen when two people have decided where they are going and are simply covering the distance. Calla found her way into the work of the Post the way she had found her way into the counterproposal, through the side door of what she was actually good at, which was people. She had a gift for reading customers that Blythe did not have and had never needed before, but needed now, as the expanded operation brought new faces and new relationships that required tending. She managed the customer accounts with the same social fluency she had always applied to social situations, only now applied to something that mattered, and the difference in her was visible to anyone who had known her before. Willa watched all of this with the particular attention of a woman who was revising a long-held understanding and taking the process seriously. She did not announce the revision. She simply began to make different decisions. She stopped directing visitors to the front room when Blythe was in the back. She stopped adjusting her introduction of her daughters by order of apparent value. Small things, but they accumulated the way small things do. The summer passed and the fall came in hard, which in Wyoming meant early, the kind of October that arrives without apology and makes clear it intends to stay. The Post was busier than it had been in 3 years. The Owl Creek route was holding. The Vance investment was performing above the projections Blythe had given Conrad, which she knew because he sent a brief note in October saying so, in his own handwriting, in the precise formal script of a man who chose his words with care. She wrote back thanking him for the note and including the updated fourth quarter projections, which were better than the third quarter projections had been. He wrote back 3 days later asking whether she would be available in the spring to consult on 2 trading posts in the Southern Territory that were experiencing the same kind of structural difficulties the Callum Post had faced 2 years prior. She sat with that letter for a long time. Holt found her reading it at the back room desk and sat down across from her and waited. "Conrad Vance wants to pay me to advise other posts," she said. He looked at her. "What do you want to do? Not what do I think? Not what should we consider? What do you want?" She had stopped being surprised by this. The particular form of his respect, which never dressed itself as consultation but was always underneath, about what she actually chose. She had stopped being surprised by it, but she had not stopped being grateful for it, and she thought she probably never would. "I want to think about it," she said. "After the winter," he nodded. "After." She set the letter on the desk. She looked at her hands, the large, capable hands, not flower-covered today, but marked with the cold and the work of the season just the same. She thought about what it meant that the man who had sent the acceleration clause in March was now asking her to teach other operations what she knew. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the quarterly accounts, because the accounts needed doing, and she was there and she had hands, and that had always been sufficient reason. The spring came on a Tuesday, the way spring comes in Wyoming, without ceremony and without asking whether you were ready, simply arriving because it was time. The snow went from the lower ground. The mountains kept their white for another month, but the road north was clear, and the fence line dried out, and the first of the season's supply wagons came through Sweetwater Crossing with the particular sound of commerce resuming that Blythe had come to recognize as a kind of music. The busted meetings of the Sweetwater Crossing Trading Association convened in May at the Decker Building on the main road, the way they convened every year, to discuss routes and rates and the shared concerns of people who moved goods through a territory that did not always cooperate with the moving. It was not a dramatic gathering. It was a functional one, the kind that got things done without requiring anyone to be particularly eloquent about the getting. Conrad Vance's representative was a man named Aldous from the Casper office, sent to confirm the terms of the Vance investment in the Callum Post and speak briefly to the performance of the arrangement in its first year. He was a compact, efficient man who said what he had to say without embellishment and sat down. Before the meeting moved to the next item, Aldous noted for the record that the Callum Post had outperformed its projections in all 4 quarters of the arrangement's first year, and that the Vance interests considered the arrangement a model for similar investments in the territory. The people in the room included several of the men who had stood outside Decker's General Store on a March morning and laughed at the sight of Blythe Callum walking alongside Holt Greer. They included women who had gathered at the church auxiliary and spoken about her body and her birthmark and the improbability of anyone choosing her for anything. They included people who had extended credit cautiously, who had watched the Callum Post with the sideways attention of those who are waiting for something to fail. No one had asked Willa to speak. Willa stood up anyway. She stood up the way she did everything, with her back straight and her chin level and her voice entirely under control, because Willa Callum had never in her life allowed a room to see her lose her composure, and she was not going to start now. The person responsible for the performance of the Callum Post for the past 4 years, Willa said, is my daughter, Blythe, not me. I managed this household. Blythe managed the Post. She managed the accounts and the contracts and the inventory and the supplier relationships and the debt, including the debt that I did not read carefully enough to understand until it became a crisis. She carried all of that without being asked and without acknowledgement and without once letting any of us see the weight of it. She paused. I kept her in the back of the house for 26 years because I believed that what she looked like made her less worth presenting to the world. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about it for a long time, and I should have said so sooner. The room was very quiet. Blythe sat at the table with her hands flat in front of her, the large, capable hands, the hands that had fixed a wagon wheel in the dark and built a fence line over 3 seasons and kept a ledger for 3 years in the small hours of the morning. Her body was what it had always been, wide across the shoulders, heavy through the middle, the birthmark dark against her jaw and throat. She did not move. She did not look at the people in the room to read their expressions. She looked at her hands, and she felt something happen in her chest that was not triumph and was not relief, but was something older and quieter than either of those things. The feeling of a weight that has been carried for so long you have forgotten what it was like to stand without it. And then one day someone takes it from your shoulders and you feel the absence of it and you understand for the first time how heavy it actually was. The meeting moved on to the next item. That was the way of these gatherings. You said what needed saying, and the business continued, which was as it should be. Holt was sitting to her left. He did not look at her with the performed significance that people sometimes apply to important moments. He looked at the table in front of him, and then he picked up his coffee cup and drank from it. And after a moment he set it back down. And that was all. But under the table, out of sight of the room, he put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. The winter that followed was the first winter she had not spent alone with the weight of the numbers. She and Holt were at the cabin north of Sweetwater Crossing by then, The cabin with the properly set porch post, and the extended back room, and the shelves he had built along the east wall with joints tight enough to hold through any season. She had assessed it and improved it and made it into a working space for two people, the same way she had made everything else in her life into a working space. Through attention and labor and the refusal to leave problems unaddressed because they were inconvenient. The baby came in January. He came fast and with difficulty, and in the early morning hours, while snow pressed against the cabin walls. And Blythe was not frightened, but she was, for the first time in her life, grateful in a way that had no calculation in it, no management, simply grateful to not be doing this alone. Agnes was there, as she had been for most of the important things of the past 2 years. She was there, and capable, and entirely in her element, which is to say she was necessary and functional, and said only what needed to be said. Holt was there in the way he was everything, present and steady, not performing the concerned husband in a way that centered his feelings over what was actually needed. He was there the way a good foundation is there. You rely on it without having to think about whether it will hold, because it does, every time, without announcement. When Agnes laid the baby in Blythe's arms, Holt sat beside her on the bed and looked at the child, and then at Blythe, and the thing she had first seen clearly on that April evening under the cottonwood was there again on his face, larger than it had been then, larger than she had known it could get. He put his forehead against her temple, just that, just the weight of his presence against her. "Are you all right?" he said quietly. "I am all right," she said. He looked at the baby. He reached out and touched the child's face with 2 fingers, the same careful attention he gave to fence post joints and ledger numbers, and everything else he needed to know was real. The baby was real. His face confirmed it. "What do we call him?" Holt said. Blythe looked at her son. She thought about everything that had led to this room, this morning, this child, the kitchen window and the flower on her hands, and the man who had asked who she was when everyone else was trying to make sure he would not notice, the fence posts packed with stone, the ledger in the dark, the letter from Conrad Vance with its 90 days, the cottonwood tree and the imperfect dress, and Calla's hands holding hers in the dark after the wedding, Willa standing up in the trading association meeting without being asked. "Silas," she said, "for the Reverend who married us." Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the small, precise nod that was his vocabulary for things he might have said at greater length. The nod that meant yes and right and I agree, and that is exactly correct all at once. "Silas," he said. "Good." Spring came again the following year the way it always comes, without ceremony, and without asking whether you are ready. The snow left the lower ground. The mountains held their white for another month. The road dried and the first wagons came through with their sounds of commerce resuming. Blythe stood on the porch of the cabin with the baby against her chest, wrapped against the April morning, and looked out at the fence line and the road and the mountains beyond. Her body was what it had always been, wide and heavy and marked by work and weather and the specific history of a life lived in full. The birthmark was the same as it had always been. The hip still gave her trouble in the cold. Her hands were what they had always been, large and capable and entirely their own. She had not become something different. She had simply become more completely what she had always been, in a life that was finally large enough to hold all of it. Holt came out of the cabin and stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at. "What are you thinking?" he said. She looked at the north fence line, where the winter had done what Wyoming winters do to fence posts, even well-set ones, and where the spring thaw was already showing her what the season had cost and what the season would require. "The north section needs checking before the ground softens any further," she said. He looked at the fence line. He looked at the baby. He put on his hat. "After breakfast," he said. "After breakfast," she agreed. She turned and handed Silas to his father, who took the child with the same careful, two-handed attention he gave to everything that mattered to him, and she went inside to start the breakfast fire. Not because anyone had sent her inside, not because the kitchen was the only place they believed she belonged, because the fire needed starting and she was there and she had hands and the morning was waiting and there was work to do and she was exactly the person to do it. She had always been that person. The world had simply needed one man with the clarity to look through a kitchen window and see it, and the courage to walk through the door and say so out loud, for that truth to become the life she had been built for all along.